Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Coverdale, V3ICV, and I'm the Radio Amateurs of Canada Advisor to WRC 23, or the World Radio Conference 23. And in my presentation today, I'm going to give you a little countdown to what's going on, because of course it's already 2022. I'll start by talking about the WRC cycle, because this is a continuous process which goes on every 4 years. So the way it works is that it all starts at the previous WRC, which was in 2019. And WRC 2019, they modified the radio regulations, RR, of 2016, and the radio regulations are, if you like, the Bible for how you conduct radio transmissions on a worldwide basis, and who has what frequencies and allowed to operate where, including amateurs. But as well as modifying the radio regulations, it also defined the agenda for the coming WRC. So after that, there's a committee called the Conference Preparatory Meeting 23-1, and they take the agenda for Walk 23 and they allocate the work, the agenda items to the relevant working parties of ITUR study groups, and defines various rapporteurs and the structure of what will be the final CPM report. And then we get into the meat of the work, which goes on for several years, and this is conducted in ITUR study groups. And ITUR study groups, there's 7 of them. They deal with spectrum management, radio wave propagation, satellite services, terrestrial services, broadcasting services, and science services. And it's these groups that do the detailed technical work that goes on for about 4 years. Finally, we have another meeting of this CPM, Conference Preparatory Meeting group, and they consolidate all these results, because we've got a lot of very in-depth technical material, and the people who finally make the decisions are more from the bureaucrats and from the administration. So they need these things boiled down, that they can easily digest. So this is what we call the conference preparatory material. And then we get into a thing called RA23, which is the Radio Communication Assembly. And this takes place just before Walk 23, and they appoint various chairmen and vice chairmen of study groups and revises the structure of the ITUR if necessary. And finally, we get to Walk 23 itself, which is typically a 4-week meeting. And this is where all of the work that's gone on in the last 4 years hopefully comes to fruition, and everybody agrees on it, and they will modify the radio regulation in 2020. For example, they will allocate frequencies, and then they'll also define the agenda for the next WRC in 2027. On top of all this, just to mention it, there is a number of regional groups that are involved in ITU work, and they cover different parts of the world: Europe, Africa, the Americas, Asia Pacific, whatever. There's 6 regional groups, and they're involved in the process to the extent that they try and consolidate views from a number of different kind of countries in their region. So the ITU has 193 member states, so you don't really want 193 different proposals. So they try and consolidate them as far as possible into a smaller number. So what's the bottom line? Well, it's a big bureaucracy, but amateur radio does have a place in this process, and we are involved in a thing called Working Party 5A. It is entitled Land Mobile Service Excluding IMT, but it does say amateur and amateur satellite service. So we are known. And people will listen to us if we say things. But there are many meetings to follow, and we have to cover a lot of different working parties as well. So this just gives you an idea of what's happening over 4 years and what we mean by a countdown. Now, one thing I can just mention is that there is a trend coming in the World Radio Conferences in that there is more and more demand on spectrum, particularly in the UHF bands. Now, 50 years ago, there was still a lot of interest in the HF and shortwave bands for broadcasting. That's less of an issue now, but as you can imagine, a lot of commercial interests involved now in the UHF and microwave bands for cellular telephony is a good example, and satellite services. So, and these are all commercial interests, and of course they aren't likely to go away. So we're all, everybody wants the limited amount of spectrum that's available. So there is a growing emphasis on the concept of spectrum sharing. Now, of course, spectrum sharing is nothing new to amateurs, and we call spectrum sharing QRM. But so we're fairly adept at dealing with sharing our spectrum, but there's more and more emphasis now on other services that traditionally haven't shared spectrum to share theirs. In fact, for this particular walk 23, the main amateur radio focuses on protecting our current spectrum. We're not looking for any more, but there are various demands on our spectrum. Let me move on to the next slide. So we have these, what we call agenda items that are under study, and this is what will form the agenda for walk 23. And at the beginning of the whole walk cycle, a number of agenda items were identified as having some implications for amateur radio. Not all of them do, of course. Some of them have nothing at all to do with amateur radio. But there are a number of agenda items that do have some potential impact. And these are the ones that we've been focusing on in terms of following closely and making sure that. So one of them is 1.12. This is an agenda item for there's possible new secondary allocation to the Earth Exploration Satellite Service, and this is a spaceborne radar sounder. It turns out that for various reasons, the people who run these radar sounders want to use 45 megahertz because this is quite a good frequency apparently for doing Earth exploration, in that it will penetrate into the ground some distance. But they're looking to they don't have an allocation at 45 megahertz for this. They're looking to move into that particular part of the band. Now, what's the implication for amateur radio? It turns out that this, even though this radar spectrum is 45 megahertz, the sounder could spill over and cause interference into our 6 meter band, the 50 to 54 megahertz. So, and let me just show you this. So this is an example of the spectrum that they proposed. And you can see that although it's centered on 45 megahertz, the side lobes are not particularly, they don't tail off too quickly. And there is still some potential for spectrum to leak into the low end of the 6 meter band, which is the edge of the band where a lot of weak signal work is done. So, in fact, the likelihood of interference in the band is low because these satellites, the radar sound, are typically only used in a remote location, and in fact, they typically they only use during the night, local nighttime. So the actual chances are of this causing an interference is pretty low, but we are, just to cover ourselves, we are trying to suggest if they could just make a tighter spectrum on their radar sounder so that the side lobes came down a bit faster, then that would pretty well remove the possibility for any energy above 50 megahertz. The next topic I want to talk about is 9.1 topic B, and this is an important one, which it's to, the text says that they want to review the amateur service and amateur satellite service in the band 1240 to 1300 megahertz, 23 centimeter band. And they want to determine if additional measures are required to ensure protection of the radio navigation satellite service. This is basically GPS. RNSS is the fancy word for essentially GPS, because we have as you know, an allocation at 23 centimeters, but there has been some interference reported in Europe in the E6 band, which is right in the middle of that band, between amateur radio applications, and they've been dealt with in the past on a national basis. However, the RNSS industry wants to revise the regulations to eliminate the possibility of interference altogether. So this is one that we have to take some care over, because the RNSS allocation is on a primary basis, whereas the amateur allocation at 23 centimeters is on a secondary basis. So in principle, we constrained that we should not be interfering at all with the primary service. So this is something we're taking some concern about, to make sure that we don't lose the band altogether. And so what's the status? So in fact, some of the studies that have been done have shown that there is some possibility, as probably not totally unexpectedly, depending on the power levels and antenna gains and distances away, there is on paper some likelihood that there could be interference from an amateur station into the radio navigation satellite service. And this shows some pictures that have been drawn or calculated, which showed as a function of frequency, they show the distances to which you'd have to go to, depending as a function of a transmitter power, to totally get away from any interference. So you can see that even if we're running 1 watt, there is that still can cause interference up to a kilometer or so away. So this is what has been done so far. The downside of it is that they haven't yet taken into account the fact that amateur radio operation of the band only amounts to a small amount in a year. So although on paper you might get some interference, the actual chances of it occurring are pretty low. So this is the argument we're trying to put forward now, so we can get some kind of acceptable compromise to continue amateur operation in terms of specific frequencies and power levels that we might have to use. Another item is item 1.14. This is there's some potential allocations required, a new primary frequency allocation to the Earth exploration satellite in the passive. This is way up in the gigahertz frequency range of 231.5 to 252. And they're looking to get a new allocation around that area. Well, this does potentially cut across, there's a primary amateur and a satellite service allocation at 248 to 250 gigahertz, and a secondary allocation from 241 to 248. So we need to be a little careful that they don't cut across our, at least our primary allocation. The current status of that is that it's a little bit bogged down in that there's other people who use those bands who are up in arms about it. So they have a couple of methods that have been proposed for addressing this, and it turns out that luckily neither of the methods really impact the amateur primary allocation, or neither of them propose the removal of the amateur secondary allocation. So for the time being, there's no real impact, but these things are never quite finished until they're finished. So we'll continue to monitor that to make sure nothing changes. There's another agenda item 9.1a, and this relates to spectrum requirements for space weather. And of course, space weather is looking at things that might be happening to the sun and corona discharges and things like that. So they're looking to get some new spectrum. And initially it seemed that the their requirements were very broad, covering a wide range of frequencies, which could cover amateur frequencies. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. However, it turns out that the main discussion so far, it's got bogged down a little bit just on the definition of space weather. And there's actually no agreement whether it should be considered an astronomical service or an extension to the terrestrial weather service. So there's been no discussion yet on spectrum requirements. So we don't have there's no potential threat to amateur radio yet, but again, we need to continue to monitor for the future. And finally, there's an agenda item 1.18. The mobile satellite service is looking for more spectrum, and they have a number of bands in mind, but one of them is 3300 to 3315 and 3385 to 3400 megahertz for future development of narrowband mobile satellite systems. And now that is, of course, the amateur service has a secondary allocation from 3300 to 3400 megahertz in region 2 and 3. And now this is limited to mobile satellite systems and non-geostationary operating at low data rate systems. So there is some possibility that this could not be might not be a major issue. And in fact, this one again has kind of got bogged down because there's no agreement between some of the proponents who are already in that band, and they've proposed a couple of methods for addressing it. But one is that they haven't even got agreement on technical characteristics of the systems that are already in those bands, so they can't really look yet on whether there's any spectrum sharing or how it might work. So anyway, cut a long story short, that neither of the methods proposed currently has an impact on the amateur service, but again, we want to continue to monitor it. So wrapping up, there's a number of meetings that we will be following that are coming up to the WRC 23, and some of them are individual working parties, and some of them are the more formal CPM meetings, which are at a bit more higher level. And then finally, we get to the WRC 23 itself, which takes place towards the end of next year, end of November, 15th of December in Dubai, whereas most of the other meetings will take place in Geneva. And typically the meetings nowadays, they're hybrid, which means that they are in person in Geneva, but they also have remote facilities using Zoom, so that it's not so difficult to be able to join in, even if it's not, you don't have a reason to be there totally in person. You can at least join in and see what's happening. And I've highlighted there with asterisks where we'd expect to be involved in person. Not all of the meetings will require that. So I think that does finish my presentation. I'd just like to thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, so this is Bryan Rawlings again, and you've heard from Paul Coverdale about the work that he's been doing on the 2023 conference, and in particular on the large issue with amateurs, which is the issue with global positioning or RNSS satellite systems at 23 centimeters. I'd like to talk about WRC Agenda Item 1.2. 1.2 is an agenda item that does affect two of our amateur microwave bands, including what is arguably our most popular microwave band, and they're under threat from Agenda Item 1.2. And they're under threat specifically with reference to the segment 3300 to 3400 megahertz, which is half of our 9 centimeter band, and our entire 3 centimeter band from 10 to 10.5 gigahertz. Both of these frequency ranges are being studied for possible expansion of international mobile telecommunications, which is usually equated to 5G cellular radio, but which is a much broader use of what we would today call cellular radio with enhanced features. So let's talk about these two bands. Both of these bands were allocated to the amateur radio service at the 1947 International Radio Conference in Atlantic City. They were both originally primary allocations. At the 1959 Geneva Administrative Radio Conference, radio location was made primary and the amateur service was made secondary. That wasn't a problem at the time and really hasn't been a problem through these years. Amateurs have been able to coexist with radio location over these many years. And at the 1979 World Administrative Radio Conference, an amateur satellite segment was designated in 10.45 to 10.50 gigahertz, the upper 50 megahertz of a band. And it's currently being used for the downlinks from the QO100 geosynchronous amateur satellite. Now, what about the 9 centimeter and 3 centimeter bands? Agenda item 1.2 seeks to study 5 frequency ranges totaling 1600 megahertz between 3 gigahertz and 10.5 gigahertz, and do that in accordance with ITU Resolution 245, which was adopted at the 2019 World Radio Communication Conference. You can read the details of the frequency segments there, but what we're interested in is 3300 to 3400 megahertz and 10.10 to 10.5 gigahertz are amateur bands, and both of those allocations are secondary. So, Resolution 245 explicitly limits sharing studies to primary users, which excludes the amateur radio service. That's commonplace. It is usually done, or has been usually done, with studies of allocation changes and sharing. And indeed, there's a whole question as to how a secondary user would talk about sharing a band with other primary users when the secondary user is specifically charged with accepting interference and not causing it. Resolution 245, however, does reference protecting the incumbent users and the need to take into account the use of the frequency bands by other services. Now, I won't dwell on this, but those particular provisions have not been easy to make much use of in the course of the discussions that have been taking place on agenda item 1.2. The amateur service have not been able to play a major role in terms of actually being involved in expressing the impact that's expected from these changes in these two bands. But RAC and the IARU continue to advocate for the interests of the amateur radio service in 10 gigahertz, and they're on record opposing the introduction of IMT in the 10 gigahertz band. So let's talk now about the upper band, 3300 to 3500 megahertz, which is the 9 centimeter band. Now, agenda item 1.2 only addresses the lower 100 megahertz of this band. That's because the upper 100 megahertz, 3400 to 3500, is already allocated as primary to mobile telephony and IMT. And in fact, I said auctioned off the 3450 to 3600 megahertz segment this past summer to IMT service providers. We haven't seen the impact of that yet, but those auctions have taken place. I should mention, just in passing though, that they did not terminate or even mention any restrictions on the continued amateur use of those frequencies. But it will be difficult to share that part of the band with what we usually pass as cellular radio. Now, With near universal deployment of cellular radio in 1800 megahertz and 1900 megahertz, and with the infrastructure that's already in place, the expansion of IMT into 3300 to 3400 megahertz is inevitable. We are going to have to learn to live with this new user in this band if we can. And we are hoping not to have the band taken away from us. There's been no suggestion in Canada that that would happen, but that IMT or 5G cellular will find its way into 3300 to 3500 megahertz over time is inevitable. I should also mention that Canada is a big country, and there's no reason why in the short term this segment of frequency, even if it is available to IMT, would be used in some parts of the country where it isn't needed. So there is probably not a lot of bad news on the horizon in the short term. RAC and the IARU are strongly advocating, however, that whatever happens in WARC 23, that our secondary allocation in 3300 to 3500 megahertz be left intact. Now, the 3 centimeter band. There already is a mobile allocation in ITU regions 1 and 3, and agenda item 1.2 seeks a mobile allocation in region 2, and therefore would authorize IMT in all 3 regions, making it a worldwide allocation. Now, here in Region 2, there already is a footnote in the radio regulation that provides a mobile allocation to 12 Region 2 administrations, so that the requested impact of WRC 23 would be to establish a worldwide mobile allocation with IMT. I thought somebody might be curious as to what these 12 administrations are. I'm not going to give you a lot of time to read them, but you will notice, however, that the United States, Canada, and Mexico, for example, are not included in the 12. They are primarily South American countries in the far south of the continent, or some countries in Central America. So, in Region 2, the primary users in 10 to 10.5 are the radio location service. These are the existing users. The radio location service and the Earth exploration satellite service in the space to Earth direction. Now, RAC has tangibly supported the IARU position, which is to express our opposition to the expansion of IMT into the 10 gigahertz band. RAC has worked closely with amateurs in other Region 2 countries to express through CTEL. CTEL is the telecommunications organization of I'm going to get it out right here in a moment, the Organization of American States. We have expressed our opposition to IMT in 10 gigahertz. So that's a summary, if you want, of where we are with agenda item 1.2. Keep your fingers crossed. I think we'll luck it out for a while at 3 gigahertz, and I'm optimistic that we'll luck it out in the long term at 10 gigahertz. And I might also mention in parting that the Earth Exploration Satellite Service, which is a service that Canada has a significant interest in, are also concerned about the advancement of IMT into 10 gigahertz. And they may do us a favor by being able to express, as they can, as a primary user, their concerns. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much for running that video for us, Marcel. All right. Well, thank you very much to Paul and to Bryan for those presentations. I wonder if anybody has any questions or comments for Paul or Bryan. As you can see, I think their presentations both illustrate the kinds of pressures that some of our spectrum's under, especially in the microwave regions. That's, I think we've been hearing for decades now that that's ultimately where the pressure is really going to come in the future against our amateur radio secondary allocations up there. But I think we can feel some degree of comfort in the fact that ISET has been very supportive of us continuing to have those secondary allocations. Pretty much all of the amateur spectrum above 430 megahertz is actually secondary. So we do have to make way for those primary users. Anyway, any questions, comments, any observations about any of these issues?
So there is a question from Bryan. I saw no reference to HF. Are we safe in that part of the spectrum?
Oh, okay. Yes, a very good question from Bryan. Paul, would you care to field that one?
Yeah, it's a good question. And hi, Bryan. Well, I think there's nothing on the agenda for this conference that I know of, although there's one of the agenda items I alluded to earlier on. I forgot what it was for now, but they're looking for potentially spectrum all over the place, but that could still be in the HF spectrum. So I think for the time being, there's nothing on the horizon, but things can change. And in fact, I was just reading, I think something just recently, that there is getting to be a somewhat renewed interest in HF, with automatic link establishment and stuff like that. And some of these, I think even there are potential uses for HF for stock trading and stuff like that, because people have realized that the internet, if you're doing any kind of stock trading, whatever, the internet, even if it's got a few milliseconds delay, that might not be good enough. So there is still some interest possibly in using sort of HF as a means of communication that's, speed of light kind of stuff. So it could happen. So, but I don't know of anything yet, and I don't think there's anything been proposed for the next walk cycle. But, we need to keep watching this stuff.
I wanted to comment as well, but if I'm not the next in line, I'll wait.
No, please go ahead, Bryan.
Okay. First of all, I support what Paul is saying. There's not an awful lot of interest in the HF spectrum, but the two potential users he mentioned are there possibly. The stock trading one seems surprising, although if there are people on here who are in the financial services field, they could go on at length, I guess, about the latency of fiber optic cables versus the latency of HF radio. But now, what I did want to point out was another thing that Paul pointed out, and which has recently been commented upon, by Tim Elam, which is that there's no new spectrum anywhere being created, obviously. So new entrants, their only possibility for them to get their service established is to share the band with someone who already has an allocation. And we are under difficulty, I guess, in the ITU, trying to justify why we have these swaths of spectrum in which we insist on having them all to ourselves. We have all kinds of different modes. We insist on operating on any frequency within the band or with our own band plans and so on. I'm not saying there aren't good reasons for that, but I'm just saying it's a difficult argument to make, because everybody else who's looking for new spectrum is finding a way to make themselves compatible with the primary users who are already there. So it's going to be a battle. It's going to be difficult in the coming years to continue to hold out for these pieces of spectrum. And when it's secondary, as Dave mentioned, which it is in almost all of our frequencies above 430 megahertz, it gets very, very difficult to justify it because there aren't that many users and there is a high demand for it, and there's large swaths of spectrum that we have there. So it's going to be difficult, and it's going to require us to continue what we're doing, which is to show up and to show up as responsible users and put our best foot forward so that we can continue to be respected the way we are. Thanks.
Actually, Bryan, I have another question that you may be well placed to answer. It comes from Mike VA3TEC. He asks, in regards to the 10 gigahertz band, I'm still a little confused. Have those frequencies already been allocated to international mobile telephony, or are they going to be allocated? Some clarification would be great.
They would be allocated if that were the decision at Work 23, but there's another element to the question, which is that some administrations act preemptively in these issues and actually do begin to use the band. They exercise their prerogatives under an article of the radio regulations, and they may then show up at the ITU basically arguing for support of what they've already done. I'm not aware if that's the case at 10 gigahertz. Certainly with IMT, I don't think so, but we've seen that in other instances. But the answer to the question formally is no. If Work 23 decides to award mobile service with IMT in 10 gigahertz, it'll be done next November.
Right, and I guess one of the elements of this is we're talking about slightly different allocations in each of the ITU regions. Just in Region 2, the question at hand is whether to extend that IMT allocation in Region 2. Is that correct?
Yes, but it won't end up with slightly different allocations. The objective is to have the same allocation worldwide, so that set manufacturers and so forth, equipment makers, don't have to have specialized options for each region or each country. Whether certain countries use that spectrum or not is another story, but the objective would be a worldwide allocation of 10 to 10.5 to IMT.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you, Brian.
Dave, I have a comment, if I may.
Please, Serge.
Yeah, thank you. This just to go on from what Brian was saying about how important it is to be showing up. Paul indicated that in one of the agenda items, two of the possible methods that have been sort of highlighted to progress the work do not adversely affect the amateur service. But everyone has to remember that the reason we need to be in that room, and albeit because it's not affecting us, we need to be, we can be quiet in the background, but these things can turn on a dime. So if somebody just says something, before you know it, the spectrum is now back in the mix, and we lose. If we're not there to fight for it and to push back, you know, we could possibly lose it. So I guess just to emphasize the reason to be there, even though things are going our way, you just never know.
Very good point, Serge. And actually, this whole discussion brings us back to one of the essential aspects of our presence in the room is because we have Radio Amateurs of Canada have been invited by ISED to provide a representative to represent amateur radio interests on the Canadian delegation. However, that delegation, or our representative, goes there at our expense, not at the Crown's expense. The expenses of the volunteers who attend these, like Brian and Paul, are paid by the Defensive Amateur Radio Fund. That's where your contributions go. So as Serge just pointed out, being there where the decisions are made, being present so we can actually influence those decisions is key. And that comes through the voluntary donations that we make to support the actions of our volunteers in forums like Geneva and the other places where these matters are handled.
Good point.
Yeah, it certainly ain't over till it's over. I mean, there's, as Sarah says, there's things can change very rapidly in a meeting, so you need to be at the table.
Okay.
I noticed there was a comment there from somebody about the 45 megahertz. I think it was somebody from VO1HP. I'm just looking at a chat there.
That's Frank.
Frank, yeah, that I was explaining that. I guess you maybe didn't quite see the whole thing. This relates to this radar sounder, and it's true. This is exactly what we're looking at. Is that it's meant to be based at 45 megahertz, but if you look at the spectrum that's been proposed now, nothing's cast in stone yet. There's not a great deal of roll off. I mean, I think they're 20 dBs down at 50 megahertz, and that, of course, the very low end of the band is exactly where we use low power stuff. So that is exactly the issue that I'm trying to flag, and I'm hoping that there's a win-win situation here, in that at this point it may not be that difficult for them to alter this spectrum. It's a pseudo-random chirp signal, and they could probably just alter some of the characteristics of it and pull in those sidebands, and it probably wouldn't impact them that much, but it might make a big difference parameters. So yeah, so that's one of the issues on the table.
All right, thank you, Paul. I have a couple of other comments here in the chat. Derek V4HAY asked an interesting question about enforcement. You know, of course, on many of our bands above 430 megahertz, we are in secondary. We're a secondary service. There are primary services. However, there are other services that operate in some of these bands that are unlicensed. And Derek asked the question, what protections do we have from unlicensed users? And I guess a short answer to Derek's question is that it really depends. It depends on some of those segments we also share with ISM users, and in some of those ISM bands, communication services have no protection from the unlicensed ISM users. So it's very tangly trying to deal with some of these questions about who has primacy, who can be protected, and who can't be protected when we get up into the microwaves. I have a comment from Marcel. Marcel's noted MICOM's recent introduction of an transceiver. That's a transceiver that includes the 6 centimeter and 3 centimeter emitter bands, among others. It seems interesting in terms of making 10 gigahertz that much more accessible to the non-hardcore techie. He asks, isn't the real problem with a lot of these bands the lack of real use by hobbyists? Paul, would you like to field that question?
Well, I mean, I guess the question is that we've got a lot of space, a lot of spectrum, and I think we do need to use it more. And I think some of it in the past has been, the equipment itself hasn't been very much available commercially, and you'd have to sort of roll your own. But I think that's changing now, and there's a lot of new equipment is coming out with the bands way up into the microwave regions. I think that's good. So, use it or lose it.
Increasing use of the spectrum would probably secure our position there better than.
Well, it's exactly what the Rick said earlier on when he goes to the FCC, and they say, well, how much are you guys using the band? And they said, well, not that much. I mean, I think that we need to be a little careful. We need to be using the band as much as possible. Okay.
So Mike VA3TEC also asked the question, after talking with several club members, what I'm finding is that equipment is not an issue. It's for the installation of repeaters. The new challenge is finding locations in which to install them. I really think that question is probably outside the ambit of our discussion here. We're really dealing with the spectrum allocation, and repeaters are but one possible use of some of these parts of the spectrum. In fact, I think probably the largest use that's made of a lot of the spectrum that we're talking about is weak signal work and other sort of more experimental modes. Okay. All right. Well, this really brings us to the end of this session. If those of you who are interested, there will be the next session will begin at the top of the hour, where we'll be discussing RAC's contest program. We'll have Bart V5CPU and Sam V5SF, who will be talking about that. Otherwise, there are two other streams with other presentations on the go. Thank you very much for your participation this afternoon, and wish you all a good afternoon.